Good morning, my friends. Grim here. I hope all is well. Welcome to another 10-minute deck tech. This one featuring Suicide Black, a mono black aggro deck in Premodern. If you love the aesthetics of old bordered mono black strategies, if you love being able to kill as early as turn 3, but you also love being able to grind and disrupt with the best of them, then you, my friends, have come to the right place. Thank you so much for watching. Appreciate all views, all feedback, and all support. Now, what on earth is Suicide Black up to? Let's get into it. Let's find out. Alright, friends, so just a quick note before we go line by line. There are a surprising amount of alternative cards you can play to the ones I'm featuring here. That is surprising because we are a mono black strategy, we are an aggro strategy, but under that umbrella, there's a surprising amount of variance despite it being gated by a relatively linear strategy and by a single color. I'll try to cover some of those alternatives as we go, but one thing for which there is no alternative is the basic swamp. We're playing 15 of them. The aesthetics of this deck are top-notch. You can't let your lands let you down. I have opted here, and there are many, many amazing options, but I have opted for these amazing swamps from Portal 3 Kingdoms, which in paper are unfortunately only available in white border to my knowledge. Online, though, they're magnificent. Masters Edition 3 is where you would find those. We have 4 Mishra's Factory rounding out the land base for a total of 19 lands, and right away, this is where an alternative rears its head because these could easily be wastelands. However, in my games thus far, I found Factory to be very effective at helping to go wide, squeeze over the line, gives us a mana sink, and I haven't necessarily missed Wasteland. I feel we can generally afford to attack the opponent's resources in other ways. If Wasteland is better in your expected meta, go for it. I'm sure it's strong. I do not advise getting a little bit greedy and trying to play both. You might assume we can because we're a mono black deck, but I'm telling you, the casting cost of a lot of these threats is pretty demanding in terms of the black production. And remember, we are an aggro deck. We depend on efficiency. We don't want to give the opponent too many turns if we can help it. Therefore, I recommend picking one or the other. Of course, Factory and Wasteland are both better in multiples. You don't really want to split them either most of the time. Moving on to the aforementioned Disruption. 3 Duress, 1 Cabal Therapy, kind of an odd-looking split in the main deck, but I think it's pretty good. Why? Well, Duress generally better than Therapy because you just want to trade with 1-for-1 somehow, generally. Cards like Pernicious Deed, removal spells, these are top-notch discard targets anyway. Even if you're playing something like Thoughtseize, you take those over creatures almost all of the time. That said, you know, the multiple copies of Duress, they can start having diminishing returns, and Cabal Therapy, as just a one-of, has some nice synergy with cards sometimes like Skittering Scourge or Carnophage that have meaningful downsides, and also you also have 3 copies of Cabal Therapy to call upon from the sideboard. So in the post-side games, when you have much more knowledge of what your opponent's up to and what you need to be afraid of, that's when Therapy really shines. We also have 2 copies of Smother for main deck interaction. Just like with other cards, this could be Edict effects, this could be different removal spells. I think Smother is good here. The Edicts are not quite as necessary as they might be in other mid-range decks because we have so much evasion in our threat suite that we don't necessarily need to be as scared of one single big threat as we do with just being able to cast our spells efficiently and kind of tempo the opponent out as we're turning everything sideways. But again, your meta, your call. This could be any number of other low-curve black removal spells. Carnophage, or Carnophage, I don't honestly know, is our early 1-drop. That's only a 3 of. It's a 2/2 for 1, which is great, but you have to pay 1 life at the beginning of your upkeep to keep it untapped. Sarcomancy is one of those alternatives where they're more or less the same, but there are minor upsides and downsides. You know, you've got one that's better against board wipes, one that's better if X happens, the other is better if Y happens. It's all much of a muchness, if you ask me. I think Carnophage is slightly cooler, and I don't think you want to play both. You're probably getting into zombies territory, which is great territory to be in, but not exactly what this deck is up to if you were to play both. We do rely on a slightly higher threat quality, even though those cards are very efficient at the end of the day. Speaking of a slightly higher threat quality, the meat of the deck exists here at the 2-drop slot, my friends. We've got Foreign and Tuco Shade. This card needs no introduction. It's a very excellent mana sink. You can snowball it to victory all on its own after you've done a lot of exchanging of resources. And then we've got the Dothies, the Shadow Legion, 4 Dothy Slayer, 4 Dothy Horror, both got basically the best form of evasion that exists, right, in the form of Shadow. Dothy Horror slightly worse unless you're against mono-white soldiers, maybe playing some Shadow threats of their own, and Dothy Slayer's drawback of attacking each combat if able, who cares? It's got Shadow. It can't block, and they can't block it anyway for all intents and purposes. 2 of Skittering Scourge rounding out these 2-drop threats. Its downside is very meaningful in such a creature-dense deck, but it's too efficient not to play as a 3/2 flyer for 2, so of course tactically you'll want to deploy this last. This is also a decent flashback fuel for Cabal Therapy if you end up deploying it and then drawing a bunch of creatures after that as the game goes long. Sinister Strength and Bad Moon are our pump effects, 3 of and 2 of respectively. Sinister Strength is better than it looks. +3, +1 is a whole lot of extra power, and you're usually equipping it, or enchanting rather, a threat with significant evasive qualities, and after having cleared the way against removal spells with duress. So the downside, of course, of getting your creature 2 for 1 is it's always live, right? But Sinister Strength is surprisingly good in this particular shell, and Bad Moon, unless you're in the mirror match, a very nice Anthem effect as well. Jumping ahead to the top end, we've got 2 very spicy 1-ofs, Hatred and Carifex Spite. Now, here's what I don't understand. I see a lot of lists out there playing only Sinister Strength and Bad Moon, which I guess is fine, but not availing themselves at all of these more all-in cards like Hatred and Spite. And what I understand even less is people playing like 3 Spite, 3 Hatred, and none of these effects. I think you want to see exactly one of these cards at the most. Sometimes they're game-winning. Hatred can get you that turn 3 win I mentioned, and Carifex Spite you saw finish off the opponent in the little bit of intro gameplay of this very video. I think they're both super cool. I love them as 1-ofs. And speaking of cards that I love, Hypnotic Spectre and Phyrexian Arena. We're a Dark Ritual deck, and despite everything I just went over, that is arguably our still very best start available to us. Turn 1 Hippie or Turn 1 Arena. Both very, very good. Arena, of course, a grinding tool par excellence in mono black decks, and Hypnotic Spectre, arguably the best card in the deck because it's got evasive clocking ability and significant disrupting ability. Also arguably the worst card in the deck, at least on mtgo, because there is no old bordered version. Get it together, guys. Come on. We need that old bordered hippie stat. Sideboard's whatever you want it to be, guys, so I won't spend much time on it, but we're respecting creatures a lot in this particular version with Diabolic Edict, Vendetta, and Engineered Plague ×2. Remember that Plague can be ritualed out T1, as can our playset of Phyrexian Negators for when we need to race combo. We already talked about Cabal Therapy. I think these are excellent in the sideboard. Tormod's Crypt for Graveyard Hate rounds it all out, but you can play any number of other alternatives. As always, your expected meta should dictate the sideboard especially. Well, thank you so much for watching, guys. I sure do appreciate it. Thank you to all patrons, and shout out also to I Play Magic, who made a magnificent deck tech about this very archetype. In future 10-minute deck techs, I plan to cover mostly decks that have not yet been seen by the Premodern community on video content at large. That said, this deck was too cool not to feature. I found it to be surprisingly powerful, very, very competitive. If you ever take it for a spin, I hope it performs just as well for you as it has for me.